I'm going to share a little bit about myself at this point. As I said, my name is Mara Walsh. I am in the United States and specifically between Philadelphia and New York. I started leading virtual tours. I started leading physical tours with EF Tours as a Girl Scout leader, taking girls and their families to international destinations every summer. I've since expanded my physical travel program and added adult-only tours and family-friendly tours. In nearly all of my tours, I have partnered with EF Tours or their adult division go-ahead tours, but we do also do customized tours as well. There are a couple reasons I started this virtual tour series. One, I really wanted to support the tour director community during this time of travel restrictions where they have little to no work. And I really wanted to keep the excitement of travel alive for my travel group and extend that opportunity to those of you who have learned about our tours through Facebook, friends, family, social media, or other means. We've done several tours in the past months since COVID has struck. If you missed any of them, they are all available on my website, which is girltraveltours.com. And we will also be putting forth many more future tours in the future. And you can see from the slide that I just put up that we have many set for the next 2 months: Scandinavia, Notable Women of Santa Fe, Mystery on the Orient Express, Northern Ireland and the Troubles, Iceland, Lucerne and the Alps. We will also be stopping in our chalet, which is a Girl Scout World Center, on that tour, Budapest, the Royals, Ontario and Quebec, and we have many more scheduled for April and beyond that will be populated in the next week or so on my website. As long as you're interested in viewing these virtual tours and presentations, we will continue to produce them. My tour director friends are happy to bring them to you, and I'm happy to host them. I know many of you found our virtual tours through Facebook, and some of you are joining us now on Facebook, so welcome. But I did want to just put out one warning for those of you who may have accidentally clicked on the wrong links or the wrong Facebook page or group and found yourself at a website where they're asking for credit cards. Please, that is not my website. It might look exactly like my photographs, my name, and everything else. But if you find yourself on a website that's asking you to put credit card information in before you access a tour, that is not mine. Do not do it. It is scam, and those people are out fishing for credit card information. So please do not do that. If you have done it in the past, you will want to contact your bank and credit card and make sure that there is no unscrupulous activity on your cards, okay? So you can always safely access my events from my website, and you see the website address on the slide that's up right now. Okay, so before we get started, I want to share with you a few ways that you can interact with us through Zoom. Through Zoom, you have a chat mechanism and you have a Q&A. If you would like to chat something with me specifically that is not necessarily a question for the tour director, please put it in the chat and I'll do my best to try to follow up as much as I can. If you have a question that you want the tour director to address after the tour, that should go in the Q&A tool. If you're on Facebook and you want to talk amongst yourselves, that's absolutely awesome. And I will try to monitor the Facebook feed as well so that we can address some of your questions over there as well. I always like to start our tour with an interactive poll, and I'm going to do that right now. This tour is a little different because we're not just touring a region, we're doing a little historical perspective of the region. So I'm going to ask a little bit of a different question. Have you ever done a war tour or concentrated your travels on these regions specifically to learn about war history? So the choices are: I've experienced it and found it fascinating. I have a similar trip booked. I plan to go on one in the future. I have no set plans, but I'm very interested in the history. Or I'm solely interested in experiencing virtual travel. I'm going to give you a minute to put in your information that suits you. And I would say I have never been on a tour like this, but I met our tour director last summer after he had just come off of a war tour, and we talked a lot about it, and I found it really interesting. So that was one of the reasons why this virtual tour was inspired. So I hope you will enjoy that. So it looks to me like the majority of people, which is about 50%, have no set plans, but very interested in history. So I know that will put a lot of pressure on our tour guide for today because of that answer. So I am going to take the poll down. I'm going to share the results with the audience just so that you can see the results real fast. There actually is, George, from your perspective, there's about 20% who've already been on a war tour. So that's pretty amazing to me. That's a pretty high percentage, but there's a large percentage of 50% plus that are interested in the history. Okay, so I'm gonna get right back into explaining what a tour director is. A lot of people aren't familiar with that title. So a tour wouldn't be complete without a fantastic tour director. A tour director is a little bit different than a tour guide because they stay with you from start to finish of a tour. They pick you up at the airport and they stay with you every day that you're on tour along the way. They're there to make sure that all the logistics are taken care of, all of the tickets are bought for the sites that you visit, and they're there to make sure that everything about your travels are stressless and you're just enjoying the tour. These are by far the most important people in the group. And of course, if we're not traveling, these tour directors have no work. So later on in the presentation, I'll share with you via chat and the Q&A and on Facebook how we can tip the tour director if we are so inclined. All the tips go directly to the tour director once collected, minus the operating expenses of the Zoom. So I'm so glad that these virtual tours have been keeping us engaged. I've heard back from so many of you that they have been a lifesaver as you've been locked down with our travel restrictions. And I know that it's been possible to bring these tour directors on for all of you. And it not only gives you something to do and you a way to keep engaged in travel, but I really have found that the tour directors have really been able to share their knowledge and their passion for travel. And it's given them a wonderful rebirth as well, because it's very hard for these tour directors not to be engaged and on tour during the year as well. So I want to thank you for showing up. I want to thank you for tipping. I want to thank you for being engaged. Today, we are lucky enough to have back one of my favorite tour directors and my Scottish friend, George McFall. And George, I'm gonna let you take this tour from here and bring you on in your microphone as well as your video. And then you can take over and share your presentation. Are you ready?
Hello, can you see me, hear me?
You're good, George.
Okay, great. I just need to remove this poll. Okay, from the beginning. Hi everybody, how are you doing? I'm George McFall. Thank you very much everybody for coming this evening. Some of you might have been to some of my previous tours. Also, thank you very much to Mara for asking me back to do this tour. I feel it's important to start the tour with a couple of disclaimers. The first disclaimer is that I am by no means a military historian. I am but a lowly tour guide, but I have done tours such as this one of the Western Front of the Second World War in real life when I used to tour in the real world. So I'm basically, what I'm going to be doing is telling some of the stories from the war related to the specific cities in question, and also adding some knowledge that I do know about the places, and also giving some other general cultural information about the places specifically generally related to warfare. The other disclaimer is that obviously the Second World War is such an enormous subject that I could give a lecture every week on the Second World War and still be here in 10 years' time. So there's various things that I'm not going to cover. It's very specific things that I'm going to talk about. For example, I mean, the Second World War, I don't need to tell you, is one of the most, probably the most horrific event in human history. 75 million, thereabouts, people dead worldwide, roughly 3% of the world's population. And it was also some aspects of the Second World War, arguably the worst history of humanity. For example, as I'm sure you know, the Holocaust. I'm not really going to talk about the Holocaust and other things like the Eastern Front in this evening's presentation, partly because I think it's such an enormous subject, it's such a serious subject that it really deserves its own tour all of itself. It's unavoidable that I will have to mention it at times, but if any of you are wondering why I'm not talking about it in depth, that's the reason. But I'm specifically going to be talking about the Western Front in relation to London, Normandy, Paris, and Berlin, stopping off in Belgium in the Ardennes forest on the way to Berlin. And the way I'm going to present the tour is as if we were on tour in real life. Okay, so I'm going to pretend that we're getting on a bus and things like that, because that seems to have worked in the past. Okay, so the Second World War, as I'm sure I don't need to tell most of you. The other thing I would say is it's very hard for me to work out the demographics of these Zoom tours. In real life, when I do the tours, often I'm working with teenagers who don't know anything about the war. Sometimes it's with army cadets. So it's very hard to gauge level of background information. But just for a very quick primer, obviously the two sides in the war, the Allies, as I'm sure you know, the British Empire, the United States, the Soviet Union after 1941, but some other countries that you might not have expected, such as Brazil, the Philippines. And on the other side of the war, the Axis powers, aka the bad guys, including Germany, Italy, Japan, but also Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. If you look at the numbers of troops and deaths, you see Romania alone had 1.2 million troops fighting in the war, which is fairly extensive. And sorry, I let the cat out of the bag there. So the residual effect of the Second World War is everywhere around us in the world today. Okay, so it is things such as nuclear weapons, nuclear war is an after effect from the Second World War. Modern day computing, this is the world's first programmable electronic computer, which is from Bletchley Park, which we'll hear about shortly. It's called Colossus, designed by a guy called Tommy Flowers. And also geopolitically, you know, things like the Chinese Revolution, the Cold War, and also the enormous economic and cultural dominance of America in the 20th century, as represented by this slide here. I hasten to add, by the way, that all the brands in this slide are brands that I have and continue to enjoy throughout my life. So I'm not complaining there, it's just a fact. But the background to the war, I don't need to tell you, was many, many different factors, but one of the main ones was obviously the First World War. And at the end of the First World War, the Germans felt they were given a bad deal. They had a lot of payments to make back to the Allied countries. They lost a lot of territory. They weren't allowed to militarize for a long time. Another major factor was the Russian Revolution. So Russia had a revolution. The socialists or the communists had taken over from the establishment, and for a lot of powers in Europe, such as the French, the British, the establishment, the political class, what they were really terrified of was communism. They were terrified of the workers rising up against them, and this was much more of a threat to the establishment than the right-wing ideologues, such as this guy, Adolf Hitler, who is the head of the National Socialists, aka the Nazis. And he became the Chancellor of Germany in 1933 through a series of misfortunate events. He was the head of the Nazi Party. He fought in the First World War, and he was basically a racist. He had very strange ideas about race and the purity of Germany. It's a big question that comes up in history. Is you know, what is fascism exactly? Fascism is the Italian Fascist Party was the first party to be called fascist. It relates to this bundle of sticks, like a bundle of sticks is stronger than one stick alone. And that's the fascisti, the word. But the Germans adopted it, and they adopted lots of things from the Roman Empire, for example, like the Sieg Heil salute. But yes, so they were very into purity of race. It was sort of scary sort of mix of science and ideology. survival of the fittest, that sort of thing. But he became the chancellor in 1933, and very soon Germany had turned into a totalitarian regime. And it wasn't long before he was remilitarizing Germany and starting to invade. He invaded Czechoslovakia, he annexed Austria, and at this point, France and Britain really didn't want to go to war. They were still recovering from the First World War, but after Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of September, they eventually declared war and then heroically did nothing for 6 months. This is what is known as the phony war. And basically, instead of running to Poland's rescue, they mobilized in France and didn't really do anything for a while. The French had spent a long time building up their defenses along the border between France and Germany. You can see here by the thick red line, and that was known as the Maginot Line, with some of the most robust defenses in the world at that time. But the Germans skipped past the Maginot Line and they went straight through the Ardennes forest eventually when they attacked France, and they simultaneously attacked Belgium and the Netherlands, and the French were taken by surprise. They didn't expect the Germans to go through the Ardennes forest, and here is a German Panzer division through the Ardennes forest in 1940. The Panzer division, there were these incredibly efficient divisions made up of lots of different units like tanks and armored vehicles, supported by the air, by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. And this was a type of warfare that came to be known as Blitzkrieg, which means in English, lightning war. And the Germans were incredibly well trained, very, very efficient, very great engineering, great machinery. And they very quickly went through France and routed the English and French all the way up to, famously, to Dunkirk, where they were surrounded. And at that point, the English, their best hope was to be rescued and taken back to England in what was basically a retreat and a huge victory for the Germans. Hitler ordered for bells in churches in Germany to be rang for 4 days in celebration of their defeat of the British and the French. So France fell. That was known as the Battle of France. And then after that, once we'd retreated into Britain, what followed was what was called by our Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, the Battle of Britain. He said, the Battle of France has been lost. Now it's time for the Battle of Britain. So moving on to London, and I'm going to talk about London more than the rest of Britain. And really, sorry, here he is, Winston Churchill. I always think that newborn babies always look a little bit like Winston Churchill. He had recently become Prime Minister of Britain. Now, he had quite a reputation in Britain for being quite reckless. He had been the First Lord of the Admiralty of the Navy in the First World War and had been responsible for an unmitigated disaster called Gallipoli. If anybody here watching is from Australia, you may be familiar with the Gallipoli disaster in the First World War. Many men, especially Australians, lost their lives in the Gallipoli campaign, and this the responsibility for this lay with Churchill. So he had a reputation for being reckless, for being too quick to go into battle, but he was better than his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, who was somewhat spineless and did everything he could to avoid going to war with Hitler. So Churchill, even though he was controversial then, he's still controversial now. He still raises controversy in society in Britain at times. He did, it must be said that he came to really embody the British will to survive throughout the war. He was a very, very fearless man. He was an interesting guy, very funny, very, very eloquent. He gave very good, memorable speeches. He was also a manic depressive and by today's standards, certainly an alcoholic. Here he is giving his famous V for Victory salute. Now, I must say to you all, if you ever come over to the United Kingdom, I wouldn't recommend making this symbol to anybody that you meet on the street in the UK, because these days it means something quite different. What we would visit when we go to London is the Churchill War Rooms. The Churchill War Rooms is where Churchill and the British government ran the war from for a lot of the war, especially during the time of the Blitz, when London was getting bombed a lot. And it's fascinating to go to. It's run by the Imperial War Museum. For many years after the war, it lay empty, but Margaret Thatcher decided to give it to the Imperial War Museum to open as a tourist attraction. And it's very interesting. You can go downstairs, and this is the map room, for example. Those aren't real people, those are models. And it's a very interesting labyrinth of sort of 1940s design and things like that. It's all been left very much intact, and you can see where Churchill and his wife slept when they were down there in their living quarters. Very interesting. Okay, so these kids, we knew before the beginning of the Battle of Britain, and probably even before the Battle of France, that the next war was going to involve aerial bombardment. Aerial bombardment was a very new tactic in war. It had started at the end of the First World War, and a lot of military strategists saw that it was the way of avoiding a repeat of the First World War. The problem with the First World War was there was this stalemate of trench warfare. And they figured by bombarding factories and supply lines and shipping convoys, they could speed up wars significantly. Also by bombing cities and civilian populations, they could decrease morale. Hitler thought that this was a particularly good tactic when it came to democracies, such as Britain, because he thought they would be more likely to be able to affect the government in these decisions. So these kids are evacuees. We call them evacuees. One of the first things that happened at the beginning of the Second World War was all the kids from the inner cities, not all, but a lot of the kids from the inner cities got sent out to the countryside to go and live with families in the countryside to be protected from the bombs that were inevitably going to come. Some of you may be familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Remember the kids in that were evacuees. They were sent to live with the professor in the countryside. And London at the time was a huge city, about the same size it is now, 9 million people. About a fifth of the population of the UK lived in London. So it was a huge, huge target for the Germans. Here's a poster for the movie, The Battle of Britain, starring Sir Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine, amongst others. It came out in '69. It's a very good movie. The thing about the Battle of Britain was it was basically a battle that took place. When I was young, I used to think the Battle of Britain was one battle that happened in one day, but it was actually a series of battles in the air between the Luftwaffe and the RAF for supremacy of daylight in the British skies. So obviously the German bombers carried on bombing London at nighttime, but for daytime supremacy, the Battle of Britain took place before the Blitz. And this was really a battle between fighter command in the RAF as opposed to bomber command. That was the part of the RAF in charge of the fighter pilots and the Luftwaffe in Germany. The Luftwaffe were run by this guy, Hermann Goering. He was one of Hitler's oldest acolytes and generals. He'd been with Hitler in 1923 in the Munich beer hall putsch. And he was, what can I tell you about him that's interesting? He got injured in the beer hall putsch and he ended up becoming a morphine addict as a result of his injuries. He was basically, the German Air Force was run by a heroin addict for the duration of the war. And on the other side, the RAF fighter command head of that was this guy, Sir Hugh Dowding. His nickname by his men was Stuffy because he seemed to be quite remote and aloof, but he's retrospectively seen as being a great leader. He had a lot of care for his men. He was also a very keen spiritualist and claimed to speak to the ghosts of the fallen RAF airmen during the war. A lot of the fighting initially in the Battle of Britain took place around Dover. You can see where Britain is closest to France in that map. Dover, you might recognize it from these iconic cliffs, these white cliffs of Dover. So the German Luftwaffe started bombing shipping convoys, especially around the Dover coast, and the RAF fighter pilots would fly out to target them and engage with them. So a lot of the fighting initially took place in the Channel and around Dover and Kent in the southeast of England. And these are the planes that the Germans were tending, the German fighter pilots tended to fly, the Messerschmitts 109 and 110. A lot of these planes had had some action already in the Spanish Civil War, where the Germans had helped the Spanish fascist dictator and General Franco to bomb the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. Some of you may be familiar with the Picasso painting Guernica. This depicts the aftermath of one such bombing raid in the Basque country. And our planes at the time were the Hawker Hurricane. That was like the workhorse of the RAF. And most famously, the most iconic plane of the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire. It was faster and more agile than the Hurricane. And they were involved in a lot of the fighter battles over the skies in the Channel, over the south of England. This is the other very important technology that we had in the Battle of Britain. This is radar. And radar was a secret initially from the Germans. They didn't know we had it. They couldn't understand how we knew where they were coming from. The pilots could intercept the Germans. They knew exactly where they were going to be coming in. and they were amazed at the RAF. And radar in some ways helped us win the Battle of Britain, because without radar, the men would have had to be patrolling the skies, and we didn't have enough fighter pilots and airplanes to do that at the time, because we'd lost a lot of planes in Dunkirk and the Battle of France. So radar was a huge technology. In fact, we so much didn't want the Germans to find out about it that, I don't know if you've heard the old wives' tale that eating carrots is good for your eyesight. Well, this was propagated by the RAF and through the British newspapers, so as to make people think, they spread this story that the RAF was eating lots of carrots, and that's why they were so good at spotting German planes and shooting them down. They were actually trying to cover up the fact that they had this technology. And you could sense the planes from about 60 miles away. They knew where they were coming in, how many planes there were, and the information would go from these masts down to these screens where people would phone up Fighter Command and tell them how many planes were coming in. These women here were working for the RAF. Lots of women volunteered for the RAF. Sadly, the women didn't get to fly the planes, I'm afraid to say. There were more archaic times back then. One woman who volunteered was this woman. I don't know if any of you recognize her. She is our current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, and she volunteered as a mechanic during the war. She went on a 6-week course and learned how to fix engines of trucks and armored vehicles and such, and was very good at it, apparently, and still to this day is very keen on engines, apparently. Here she is with her mum and dad. This is the king, her father, King George VI. He only became the king in 1937. His brother was meant to be the king, but he abdicated. This is him, Edward VIII, so that he could marry Wallis Simpson, who was an American divorcee, which meant that he wasn't able to be the king. It's just as well he didn't become the king, because it turned out that one of his great friends and somebody who he admired very much was Adolf Hitler. And both him and Wallis Simpson went to meet Adolf Hitler several times. So if he had been the king, it would have been a little bit awkward in 1939 when war broke out. But back to the Battle of Britain. So the German Luftwaffe changed their tactics a few times. They started off bombing convoys, and then they started trying to target the airfields of Fighter Command, the RAF themselves. And towards the end of August, the fighting got very bitter indeed. And this very famous day, the hardest day, the 18th of August, 1940, when we lost something like 68 British planes. We lost half of them in the air, half of them on the ground, and the Germans a similar number. And actually, towards the end of August, the RAF in total lost about 500 fighters. It was a very hard time in the Battle of Britain. But what happened next was, in fact, we started it because we sent some bombers across to Berlin and bombed Berlin. And Hitler was furious at this, that we would dare to go and bomb his civilians. So they decided to change tactics, and they started bombing London. Both the factories in the East End that were building the munitions and such, but also the civilian population. As you can see by this slide here, this guy watching out for planes in the London sky with St. Paul's Cathedral in the background. Oops, pardon me. This started on the 7th of September, and these were daylight raids. They weren't like the Blitz in the nighttime. They were daylight raids, and there was a huge raid on the 15th of September, which is known as the Battle of Britain Day. And during this day, this was basically the resounding victory for the RAF. They changed tactics. Instead of having a few planes go up to meet the Germans, they sent all the planes, all the Fighter Command planes into the air at the same time, and they destroyed a huge part of the German Luftwaffe, and it was a great day of victory. And after that, the Germans didn't send any more planes during the day, but they did send the planes at night. And from September until May 1941, we entered into this period known as the Blitz, where they were bombing every night. I just wanted to say, actually, that it's definitely it's important to remember that not all the pilots in the Battle of Britain were British. Okay, about 20% of them came from overseas: Canadians, Australians, New Zealand, French, Belgian, Czechoslovakian, but the most German planes shot out of the sky were shot by this squadron, the 303 Polish fighter squadron. They shot down more planes than any other squadron. So I thought they certainly deserved a mention. But onto the Blitz. Okay, so this was 8 months that this went on for. And then, for example, from September, 76 nights in a row, London was bombed. It was a huge, huge campaign. And I mean, I'm in London now, and I live in London. London, the way it looks is very much dictated by the Blitz. 1 million homes and houses were destroyed. Something like 40,000 tons of bombs were dropped on London. It completely changed the way the city looked. And There were various reasons for this. Some of them were tactical, blowing up factories, etc. But a lot of it was to destroy the morale. But that's the one thing that didn't happen. If anything, the opposite happened. And people really came together as a result of the hardship of the Blitz. And there was this thing that we call the Blitz spirit that happened. Here you see some people, and they were sleeping in the underground. Lots of people slept in underground stations at night to protect themselves from the bombs. 150,000 people a night, they reckon, on average, during the Blitz, slept in the underground. This is a good photograph showing the Blitz spirit, the guy delivering the milkman delivering the milk. He looks quite cheerful, doesn't he, walking over rubble. And people say that the British at the time, or the Londoners at the time, they talked about the bombs of the Blitz like it was the weather. They would say, oh, it's very blitzy tonight, isn't it? And they were just very casual and dry about it all. And it really brought them together. And even the King and Queen came out to the East End to look at the bomb damage. And even their house, Buckingham Palace, was hit by some bombs. So everybody was included in it. The only building that didn't have any significant bomb damage was St. Paul's Cathedral, which miraculously escaped the bombs. This is a view from St. Paul's Cathedral looking east. As I said, the East End of London in particular was hugely decimated during the Blitz because of it being where a lot of industry was, factories, workers, that sort of thing. So this photograph, and it's quite hard to look at, but you can see just how much of the city was destroyed during the Blitz. This is the same view today, and you can see this is where a lot of the more modern buildings, this is the financial city of London, where all the banks are based. And beyond it, the other skyscrapers behind it, that's Docklands, which is another financial center. So a lot of the modern look of London is as a result of the Blitz and the rebuilding of London after the war. We're going to head very quickly on the bus 50 miles north up the road to Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park was where the code breakers worked in top secret during the Second World War, the most famous one of which was this guy, Alan Turing. So the code breakers, sorry, my mouse is getting in the way. The code breakers, they worked in top secret, and their job was to decipher the German codes, the most famous one being the Enigma code. The Germans would cipher all their messages, and some Polish scientists, in fact, started the job of cracking the Enigma code. And Alan Turing and his team in Bletchley Park took it over from them. The other guy that I mentioned before is this guy, Tommy Flowers, and he built this machine, the Colossus computer machine. It was the first programmable electronic computer. He was employed by Alan Turing, in fact, at Bletchley Park. And he was unlike most of the other code breakers. He came from a very humble background in London's East End. It's quite a sad story, Tommy Flowers, actually, because after the war, they destroyed all the Colossus computers, and he wanted to build another one, but he wasn't allowed to tell anyone that he'd built the ones during the war because had signed the Secrets Act. So he went to the he went to a bank to try and get a loan to build this computer, and the bank manager looked at the plans and said, this thing won't work, what are you talking about? And he wasn't allowed to say to the bank manager, I already made one, it saved the world in the World War. And these machines are very important in cracking a lot of codes relevant to the D-Day landings, which we're going to hear about shortly. Even Tommy Flowers' children didn't know that he'd built this world's first computer until much later in the 70s. So he was a great scientist, but wasn't allowed to flaunt it in any way. And he worked for the post office for the rest of his life. On the way back to London, I would recommend going to the RAF Museum in Hendon, North London. This is one of these museums that not a lot of people know about. It's quite far north in London, but it's an RAF museum. They have every kind of aeroplane from every military campaign the RAF's been involved in. It's fantastic, check it out. And the other museum that I would recommend is the Imperial War Museum. If you're interested in military history, the military, it's just in the south of London, south of the Thames, and it's fantastic. It's got a huge section on World War II. Everything you could want. It's a must visit if you're in London. Okay, the next day we are going to head down, the next day as it were, we're going to head down to Portsmouth from London, which is on the south coast, and it's where the British Navy has always been based. If we get to Portsmouth in time, I might take us for a walk and we can go and have a look at this, the HMS Victory. This was Admiral Nelson's flagship during the Battle of Trafalgar, and you can visit it in Portsmouth now. but we're going to get on our ferry and head across the sea to Normandy. And while we're on the ferry, there's a bit of catching up to do, because we were last in the war in 1941. And then what happened after that, very importantly, Hitler made a classic mistake in European warfare. He invaded Russia. Okay, this is a mistake that Napoleon had made before him. And it was an operation called Operation Barbarossa in 1941. And really, for Hitler, his luck started changing after that event. And at that point, the Russians became our allies in the war. Initially in the war, they'd signed an agreement with Germany where they would carve up Poland between them and not bother each other. But Hitler invaded and broke that deal, the Molotov-Ribbentrop. In 1943, there was a conference in Tehran, the Tehran Convention, and here's the three leaders: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And at this convention, Stalin was very angry with the other leaders because they wouldn't start a front in the West. He wanted the Germans fighting a war on two fronts. And quite rightly so, actually, because Churchill had been dilly-dallying somewhat when it came to that. The British had been concentrating a lot on North Africa, Greece, and Italy, the theatres of war where my grandfather fought, in fact. And they were very keen, Stalin was very keen that they would start the front, they would invade France and start the sweep from the West. So it was decided that this guy would be in charge of the operation. Eisenhower, later your president in America. And the campaign was called Operation Overlord, which was to take back Europe, landing from Britain into France and then through into Germany. So they had to decide where to make the landing. The Germans were expecting this. They'd built this enormous fortification, the Atlantic Wall. It went all the way from Norway down to Spain, but it happened to be weakest around Normandy, which you can just see in northern France there. But the Germans were expecting an attack at some point, but they didn't know where it was going to come. So we tried to convince them that the attack was going to come around Calais, which is just across the water from Dover, you can see on this map. So we did all sorts of elaborate things, like we posted armies to near Dover to make them think that there was an army amassing to attack there. We put inflatable tanks. This is an inflatable tank we put on the beach. We lined them up so that the German aeroplanes would think that tanks were lining up to invade. One major problem with the Normandy coast, where they decided to have the D-Day landings, was that there was nowhere for ships to dock. There was no harbors. The nearest harbors were Cherbourg and places. And so they decided the best tactic was to build these artificial harbors known as the MULBERRY harbors. And parts of these harbors are still there near the beaches. You can still see them today from some of the beaches. And it was a huge operation which they had to do in secret. And there's so many aspects of it. For example, the weather, they had to get it on a full moon. It had to be a spring tide so that the airborne divisions could see. And it was so complicated to plan. But eventually they picked a date, but the date that they picked didn't work because the weather was too bad. So eventually they decided they had to go on the 6th of June, even though the weather wasn't perfect, or they would have had to wait weeks for the next opportunity. So eventually on the 6th of June, as you can see here, 165,000, I heard, Allied soldiers crossed the sea. And this is how the invasion beach was subdivided. Beaches Utah and Omaha were the American landing beaches, Gold and Sword, the British ones, and Juno was for the Canadian divisions. The first thing that happened, I mean, if you can imagine, you're a German soldier on the Normandy coast, waking up at, let's say, 5 o'clock on the 6th of June, and as far as the eye can see, all you can see is boats. There's attacking boats and soldiers coming. It would have been a very unsettling sight indeed. And the troops in Normandy weren't the best German troops. They were either very new recruits who had come from the east, or they were soldiers who had been in France for the duration of the war, not seen much action, spent a couple of years eating cheese and drinking wine, and were pretty out of shape. So they weren't Hitler's best forces by any stretch. And these guys were the first to land, the airborne divisions. They were sent behind enemy lines. It was a bit of a disaster, in fact, the drop zones. A lot of the pilots that dropped them off didn't really know what they were doing. But eventually they got behind the enemy lines, and they did what they did best, which was wreaking havoc behind enemy lines, cutting off railway lines, supply lines, that sort of thing. I don't know if some of you might have seen the movie The Longest Day, which is all about the airborne drop in D-Day. Also the HBO series Band of Brothers, which is fantastic. all about the 101st Airborne Division. And there's a great, in fact, it's the second episode, I think, is all about D-Day. And you see this drop behind enemy lines, which is amazing. And the other famous, another very famous assault in D-Day is this, the Pointe du Hoc, which is the 2nd Battalion Rangers. And they had the very unenviable task of taking this jutting out point into the coast. Let me try and find the map. Yeah, here we go. Can you see between Utah and Omaha, Pointe du Hoc? See, the Germans had a defensive position here where they could easily fire upon both the Americans on Omaha and the Americans on Utah Beach. So it was very important to take that from the Germans. But as you can see, it's very, very sheer cliffs up the top. So it was a very thankless task that the Battalion Rangers had. They had borrowed ladders from the London Fire Brigade, which they put up against the cliffs. They climbed to the top, getting shot upon by the Germans. They were being supported by some of the boats that were firing upon the land. And you can see in this slide the craters in the landscape. It's some of the most cratered landscape you could ever possibly see. It's incredible to visit. But eventually the Rangers got to the top and they managed to take over the defenses. It's a really incredible story. And here's a recreation of the Rangers going over the top. But it must be said, out of all the beaches, by far the hardest beach was Omaha. It became known as Bloody Omaha. Some of you may have seen Saving Private Ryan, the first 20 minutes, which are the 20 minutes that everybody likes best. These depict Omaha, the first wave of the taking of the Omaha beach. Now, people thought that the air forces, the Allied air forces, had been bombing extensively the German defenses, and they thought the German defenses were going to be significantly weakened, but that wasn't the case. They'd completely missed their targets, and the German defenses were not affected. And on Omaha Beach, the Germans had a great position looking down upon the beach. And when the troops arrived on Omaha Beach, they came in these boats, and as the front of the ramp went down, a lot of them were greeted with machine gun fire, and something 90% of one of the units was wiped out instantly when they arrived on Omaha Beach. It was the hardest beach by far to take, and many, many men died as a result. They sent some tanks as well onto Omaha Beach, but they released them too early. The sea was very choppy, and out of the 29 tanks they sent, 27 of them ended up sinking to the bottom of the sea. So it was by far the most treacherous of all the beaches. But eventually, the Germans started running out of ammunition, and one by one, the Americans managed to take over the German defenses and defeat them. But that was by far the bloodiest of the battles. And here's more photographs. This is Omaha Beach after the first landings. Nearby Omaha Beach is this cemetery. It's called Colville-sur-la-Mer, and it's the main American cemetery on the Normandy beaches. And this is the one that I would recommend, if you're American, that I would recommend that you visit. They have ceremonies every day honoring the dead. I highly recommend it. I was there 2 years ago on tour when it was the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. Here's a photograph. These guys are some of the only veterans left alive that were involved in the storming of the beach, and they were there at the ceremony. The guy on the left is Emmanuel Macron, the French president. And if we had time, I would also go, if possible, if we were on a real tour, I'd go to visit this cemetery. This is called La Combe Cemetery, and it's the German cemetery in Normandy. And as you can see, the German gravestones are very Teutonic looking, aren't they? Very Germanic looking. But it's a very interesting visit. If you go and visit, I would definitely recommend that you go there as well. Okay, on our tour, on our fantasy tour, we would at this point stop for some lunch. So I would recommend going to this place, Arromanches. And in fact, you can see in this slide, if you look out to the sea, the remains of one of those mulberry harbors, I think, if it's not blocked by my face. If it is, I apologize. And this is a great place to stop. It's very near Gold Beach, one of the British landing beaches, and it's a nice place to go and get a nice bowl of mussels or something like that. Some moules frites. If you want, you can accompany them like this French person with a glass of rosé and a pastis. Not a great combination in my book, but there you go. And after that, we would visit Juno Beach, which is where the Canadians landed. 14,000 Canadian troops landed on Juno Beach, and it was a very, very slick operation indeed. There's a very famous battle for a famous bridge near here called Pegasus Bridge. There's also a great memorial center for the Canadians, the Canadian landings on Juno Beach, which I would highly recommend. Here's a photograph of the Canadians arriving on Juno Beach. One thing I would say about visiting the Normandy beaches, if you're Canadian, that's an advantage over the Americans, is the Canadians are actually allowed to take a little bit of sand home with them, whereas the Americans, I'm afraid, are not allowed. I've learned this through bitter experience. So this is the capital of Normandy. It's a town called Caen, C-A-E-N. And the thing about the D-Day landings to remember is it wasn't just a day, it was a huge battle, the Battle of Normandy. It went on for months, and it was a very vicious battle and struggle that was won very bitterly, and it involved a lot of Allied bombing of Normandy, and something like 20,000 French civilians died as a result of Allied bombing in Caen alone. You can see this is a photograph of Caen after being bombed by the Allies. So yeah, but incidentally, in this photograph of Caen, this castle in the foreground, that's the castle that William the Conqueror was born in, and before he went to invade England in 1066. So yes, this is his neck of the woods. So quite often on a real tour, we would stay in Caen, and this is where we'd stay. The other thing I would say, if you're keen on the Second World War and you find yourself in Caen, you must go to the Caen Memorial Museum. For my money, I think it's one of the best Second World War museums. It gives the whole background to the war and also to the D-Day landings. It is a fantastic visit, I would say, essential if you're in the area. Okay, so next on our tour, we're going to head to Paris. I'm showing you this touristic map here just so you get a grasp of where we are geographically. So we're in Caen at the minute, and we're going to drive to Paris, which is going to take about half a day. Now, France in 1940, we're going to go back in time a little bit now. You remember the Germans swept through, they won the Battle of France, and on the 22nd of June 1940, an armistice was signed, which is essentially a capitulation by the French. And France was divided into two zones, okay? So the zone at the top, the yellow one, this is the German occupation zone, and that was essentially run by Germany. The zone at the bottom, the blue zone, that's the free zone, and that was run by a provisional French government, which is now known as the Vichy government. You can see at the top of the blue in the middle is this town Vichy. That's where the government temporarily moved, the government of the free zone. And this Vichy government was run by this guy on the left, Pétain, P-E-T-A-I-N, Marshal Pétain. And he was basically, the way he's painted historically is that he was like a puppet. He was like Hitler's puppet in France. And he was extremely conservative, right-wing. He was very anti-communist, anti-Anglo-Saxons, and in fact, very anti-republicanism, which in France was a big deal, because in France they'd had the revolution in 1789, and France was a fiercely, and remains to this day, a fiercely proud republic. So for him, basically cooperating with the Germans came very naturally to Marshal Pétain. And in fact, this time in French history we refer to as Vichy France, okay, after the Vichy government. Paris had been invaded by the Germans not that long ago. In the 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians, who were basically the Germans before Germany, but it was unified. The Prussians had severely humiliated the French at the end of that war. And this is sadly not a photograph. Although some photographs do exist from the Franco-Prussian War, I couldn't find them for this presentation. So it wasn't the first time that Parisians had Germans marching in the streets of Paris. And here the Nazis marching on the Champs-Élysées in front of the famous Arc de Triomphe, which is itself represents French military might, because it was built in dedication to Napoleon's great army, who at the time were the greatest army in the world. So it wasn't long after the armistice was signed that Hitler came to visit Paris for the first and only time. And it was a big propaganda campaign. He was filmed in front of the Eiffel Tower. Here he is with his generals, and he was shown around by some of his friends who are artists and architects, like Albert Speer, the architect for the Nazis. This is a very, incidentally on a Paris note, this is with the best view of the Eiffel Tower where the Nazis are in this photograph, which is called the Trocadero. And if you go to Paris, this is where to get the best view of the Eiffel Tower, especially at sunset like this, or when it illuminates at night. I always take groups there. This is the other guy that we need to talk about in talking about France, General Charles de Gaulle. He was a general in the French army, and at the end of the Battle of France, he escaped to Britain, where he formed a French resistance in exile. And the name of his part of the resistance was the FFF, the French Free Forces. And from Britain, from London, he broadcast to France, encouraging people to rise up against the occupying Germans. The thing about the French resistance is we have a very romantic idea about the French resistance, that they were running around executing German officers willy-nilly. It didn't happen as much as we'd like to think. And towards the end of the war, when it became clear that the Allies were winning, the resistance action was ramped up somewhat. But actually, on the few occasions that German soldiers were assassinated, in Paris, for example, the Germans, for every one German soldier that was executed, the Germans executed something like 20 Parisian citizens. So it was very brutal. It wasn't something that people did a great deal. It must be said, when Paris was occupied initially, about 2/3 of Parisians fled the city. If you had any money at all, you would have definitely fled the city, fled Paris. There was severe rationing in Paris. Food was restricted. Lots of the food in France was sent to Germany. In France, one thing that I find very strange is that the clocks in France were changed to German time, so that even the time changed in Paris. And also, extreme rationing, tobacco, caffeine, coffee, which is a disaster in France. And so there's hardly any fuel, so people didn't really get around the city much. There were hardly any cars on the streets. People cycled a lot more. But yeah, Charles de Gaulle ran one branch of the resistance. The other main branch of the resistance was led by the Communist Party, and inevitably the Communist resistance and Charles de Gaulle's FFF didn't see eye to eye whatsoever. This is Charles de Gaulle. He later became the president of France between 1959 and 1969, and he was famous for his speeches where he used to wave his arms around. One of my favorite facts about General Charles de Gaulle is, in France, you know, this type of corkscrew, lots of French still call this kind of corkscrew a General de Gaulle, because of the way that its arms flap up and down. That's how his arms moved when he was giving speeches. If you're interested in the French resistance, by the way, I would highly recommend this documentary, The Sorrow and the Pity, in French, Le Chagrin et le Pitié. It was released in the late 60s. It was banned in France until the 80s. And it's actually about the lack of French resistance and the collaboration that happened during the Vichy years in France, in occupied France. And yeah, it came out at the time that Charles de Gaulle was the president of France, so it was that was very deliberate at the time as well. And as I say, it was banned. It's still a controversial film in France, but if you're interested in this side of the war, that's a must-see. So not as much resistance as we'd hope, but collaboration there certainly was. And the saddest collaboration there was in 1942, when 13,000 Jewish citizens in Paris were rounded up, not by the Gestapo, but by the French police, and sent to concentration camps, many of them to Auschwitz, where their lives ended. So when it comes to collaboration, that's the most serious crime that you can level against French collaborators. Now, I'm not saying that in any kind of judgmental way. I think if Britain had made peace with the Germans, which Hitler certainly wanted to do, Hitler was a great fan of Anglo-Saxon culture. He loved the British and their empire, their colonies, etc. If the British had ended up coming under German influence, I'm sure we would have done the same thing. There's these islands in between England and France called the Channel Islands, and they came under German jurisdiction during the war. And the British police on the Channel Islands did a similar thing with the Jewish population there. So yeah, I'm not in any way being anti-French, but this is a very sad truth about the collaborationist France during 1942. Paris also became a real playground for German soldiers. When German soldiers had leave, their favorite place to go to was Paris. Okay, they would go and they would eat and they would drink and they would have a nice, and they would whoop it up. And Paris at the time was a very sort of sophisticated place, lots of artists, lots of culture. Edith Piaf, the famous French singer, she did many, many concerts for German officers during the war. And in fact, a lot of citizens in Paris coexisted very happily with the Germans, it must be said. One of the most famous ones is Coco Chanel, who was actually living with a Gestapo officer throughout the war in Paris. And as a result of which, when the war ended, she had to run away from Paris because she was too worried about the recriminations, because the collaborators got punished severely after the war. Thousands of them were tried and a couple of hundred were executed as well. So Coco Chanel was one of them. But after the D-Day landings, when it became clear that the Allies were making good headway and were likely to liberate France, that's when the resistance really stepped up. And there's this famous event, the Battle of Paris in August in 1944, in which the French resistance, both the communist branch and the FFF, took over municipal buildings, and there was fighting in the streets. Paris, they love fighting in the streets. And this is a fantastic photograph, I think, of French resistance unit during the Battle of August, looking very cool, I think. And it was at this point that Hitler's general, a guy called von Choltitz, famously was given instructions by Hitler when he thought that Paris was inevitably going to fall, that he was going to burn Paris. Hitler gave him instructions to burn Paris to the ground. And there's this famous question that he asked him on the phone: "Is Paris burning?" And the general lied and said it was, but actually he'd already surrendered the city and left the city intact, which is why Paris looks a lot older than a city like London or Berlin, for example. At the end of August, the French troops, and accompanied by American troops, came back to Paris and liberated it, followed a few days later by General de Gaulle, who made a very rousing speech. The other thing that we would visit if we were in Paris would be the Army Museum. It was historically for a hospital for army invalids, but it's now a very, very big museum with all sorts of exhibits about different military campaigns, a huge one about the Second World War. Brilliant, very interesting to visit. But the main exhibit at this museum, the one thing that everyone goes to see at this museum, is Napoleon's tomb. And Hitler himself in 1944 went to visit the tomb of Napoleon. They were very different. They were both tyrants in some ways, but they were very different in other ways as well. Napoleon was actually quite tolerant of different religions and different people. But the one thing they had in common was they both made the mistake of invading Russia, which was arguably their undoing in both cases. Okay, so from Paris, we're going to head to Belgium, to around the Ardennes forest. Remember, we talked about the Ardennes forest in the beginning of the Battle of France. The Germans came through the Ardennes instead of going through the Maginot Lines. You can see here the way that the troops moved from Normandy up to Belgium, to Bastogne. And by this time, the troops had been fighting for months. This was the autumn now of 1944. They were exhausted. And the supply lines, one of the most challenging things was supplying this enormous army of a couple of million men. And the supply lines had grown very thin. So they decided to stop advancing because they'd been advancing very fast. And they figured that the Ardennes forest, here it is, was a safe place to try and pause a little bit and replenish the supplies. And the army was relatively thin at that time in the Ardennes. They never thought that Hitler would try anything because they clearly had the upper ground and the upper hand, and it was a very treacherous place to attack through. However, Hitler decided he was going to launch an enormous offensive against the Allies at exactly this point, partly because he was enraptured with the memory of his victory at the Battle of France. His generals thought it was a terrible idea. They realistically knew that they were going to lose the war at this point. But Hitler sent 400,000 men up to the Ardennes forest, largely undetected, it must be said, partly because the weather was appalling. Also, communications were bad. The British had some intelligence that they ignored. They didn't think that the Germans were going to launch this offensive. And this is the bloodiest battle in the American experience of the Second World War. And this is called the Battle of the Bulge. Very close to the Ardennes forest was the Siegfried Line, which was marked the border between Germany and France. And this was what the Allied troops were hoping to get to. These were the two generals of the Allied army. On the left is Montgomery, Monty, as he was known to his troops, and on the right, George Patton, General Patton. Now, these guys look like they're having a lovely time, but they actually detested each other. There's great animosity between them. They were both quite polarizing individuals, it must be said, in general. They rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. But they were both great generals as well, particularly Patton. He was a great proponent of leading from the front. He was certainly no coward. He was very brave, very admired by his men, as was Monty. But Hitler learned that there was some problems between them, and he decided it would be a great tactic to break through the line, divide the two armies, and break on through. I'm sorry, this image isn't very good. I couldn't find a better one. Break on through the Allied lines, past the Meuse River, up to Antwerp, which was a deep water port, which is very important at this time for the Allies. Take it back, circle the army to the north. Hitler's fantasy was that he would then make the Allies surrender, and then he would persuade them to join him in a war against the Soviet Union. That's where Hitler was at that time when it came to reality. But it was a brutal campaign. Initially, the German army there was twice as many of them as the Americans there, and they burst through the American lines and created this shape which looks like a bulge, which is why it's called the Battle of the Bulge. It's also known as the Battle of the Ardennes. And the Germans, Hitler sent not only 400,000 armies, but some of his best armies as well, and some of his most state-of-the-art technology, such as the Tiger tank, which was the fear of all the Allied armies. It was incredibly impenetrable, very well armored, about 50 tons, a really efficient gun. The one thing about it, as with so much German engineering, is that it was almost too well made. And for example, it took about 4 times as much fuel as a normal tank, which meant that quite often they ran out of fuel and just had to abandon the tank. Similar with the Nazi machine guns. The machine guns were so well built that they took about 4 times as long to build as the Allied machine guns. So almost too much attention to detail when it came to that. So back to the Battle of the Bulge, and the famous battle fighting took place around this village Bastogne that you can see on this map. The other thing about the Battle of the Bulge was that it took place in the winter, December and January 44-45, and it was one of the coldest winters on record. It was so cold that they said the boiling water in one of the canteens actually turned to ice, and also the nails in the Germans' army boots froze and ended up burning holes in the feet of the German. That's how cold it was. And there's lots of hypothermia, frostbite. You can see this picture. The American soldiers were in the middle of this forest, had to dig themselves foxholes that they lived in for months, getting continually shelled and bombarded by an enormous amount of German artillery, sleeping in the freezing cold. If you haven't seen Band of Brothers already, you must watch it if you're interested in the Second World War. But my favorite episode is called Bastogne, and it's all about the Battle of the Bulge, and it's incredibly realistic. The depiction they have of the battle there, you must watch it. And Bastogne in particular was surrounded by the Nazis, and it looked like they had no option but to surrender. And the Germans even famously, and there was a couple of divisions left in Bastogne, and it didn't look like they were going to survive. So the Germans eventually sent them a command to surrender, to which the commander of 101st Airborne Division sent the very famous one-word response to the German request to surrender, which just said the word nuts on it. He was called McAuliffe. And it was just one word. It said nuts on it. And when the Germans got this response back, they said, well, what does this mean, nuts? And somebody had to translate it to them and say, oh, it means, go to hell, basically. And they said, right. So then they started the bombardment again, but just at the very last minute, General Patton's Third Army broke through the Nazis to the south and relieved the men of the Airborne and some other divisions as well in Bastogne, and eventually won the Battle of the Bulge. And that was really the end for the Germans after the end of the Battle of the Bulge. And it was by far the most brutal campaign for the Americans. They lost a lot of men. And after that, that was the end. There was fairly plain sailing for the Allies into Germany thereafter. For the final stop in this tour, whistle stop tour, we're going to get the train from Cologne to Berlin. So Cologne's just across the German border from the Ardennes and Bastogne. Oh, incidentally, if you go to Bastogne, there's an amazing monument that you can go in and you can climb up to the top, and you see in all directions around you the territory. where the Battle of the Bulge took place. So Cologne, you'll see Cologne is on the River Rhine, the great emblem of Germany. And you can see the famous Cologne Cathedral as well in this photograph. But we're going to get a train for 5 hours east, is our train, and we're going to arrive in Berlin. You can see from this map, Cologne to Berlin, heading east. And Berlin, as you can see from this photograph, it looks very different to a city like Paris. And this is partly because it was completely obliterated during the Second World War. As we heard earlier, the RAF started bombing it in 1940, and they carried on bombing it throughout the war. And at the end of the war, there was this situation where the Soviets and the Allies were basically both racing towards Berlin to see who could get there first, because they were aware that when the war inevitably ended, there was going to be a power struggle between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, as there was, which we now know retrospectively turned into the Cold War. So there's this struggle, there's this race to get to Berlin. Who could get there first, the Soviets or us? And the Soviets got there first, and they completely annihilated Berlin. We'll talk about that a bit more shortly. Hitler had a very complicated relationship with Berlin. Traditionally, Berlin had been a hotbed for communism in Germany. During the 1930s, some of you may be aware, Berlin was a very progressive city during the Weimar years. Some of you may have seen the movie Cabaret, based on the book by Christopher Isherwood, I Am a Camera. So it was a place where people could very much lead progressive lives, and you know, it was a relatively free place and quite the antithesis of Nazism. It was also a very working class communist place. The Nazis their support tended to come from the south of Germany, which is more conservative, Bavaria, for example. So there's lots of street battles in Berlin between the communists and the Nazis in the 1930s. So Hitler wasn't mad keen on Berlin, and he had great plans for Berlin. He was going to change the name of it to Germania, and he had plans to rebuild it completely into this city. These are the plans that you can see here that he made with Albert Speer, his architect. It looks like something out of Blade Runner or something, doesn't it? And at the end, you can see this big domed building that was going to be called the Volkshalle, the People's Hall. And if it had been built, it would still to this day be the largest interior space of any building in the world. But it wasn't to happen. But there are some other famous Nazi buildings in Berlin. For example, this one, Tempelhof Airport, which I think is an incredible design if you're into totalitarian deco. This was built and developed by the Nazis in the 1930s, and it carried on being, after the war, it ended up becoming an American military base during the Cold War years. And then it became an airport again, but it closed down at the beginning of this century. And now it's actually a public park, and they use it for various other things, including housing asylum seekers in the Nazis' old airport, which I think is very fitting. This is the Topography of Terror Museum in Berlin, and this is built in what used to be the Gestapo building in Berlin. You can see where this wall is at the end, that's the remaining part of the Gestapo building, and there's still some cellars intact underneath it where the Gestapo, for those that don't know, were the Nazi secret police. And they're cellars where they would interrogate and torture their political opponents. Etc. And this museum is fantastic, and it tells the whole story of the rise of power of the National Socialists and how that came about and what conditions led to it and the results. Just around the corner, and the most iconic monument in Berlin obviously is this, the Brandenburg Gate, as you can see here in the 1930s during a rally, during a Nazi rally. And here it is in happier times, i.e. now. And the other very famous image of the Brandenburg Gate is this, which is from 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, because the Brandenburg Gate was in East Berlin, whereas where the photograph's being taken is in West Berlin. So this photograph really represents the end of the divided Berlin in 1989, which I remember very well. Haven't quite got time to go into that now, and I believe that Mara already did a tour of Berlin, which you can watch on her channel on YouTube. It'll probably explain it a lot better. As I said at the beginning, I haven't got time to talk about everything, I'm afraid. The other very iconic building is this, the Reichstag, where the German government is based. And it's very relevant to this, the story of the war and the Nazis, because in 1933, it was just a couple of weeks after Hitler became the chancellor, there was a fire in the Reichstag and the communists were blamed. And Hitler used this as an excuse to essentially dismantle German democracy, instigate dictatorship, totalitarian dictatorship, and he removed basically all civil rights, he removed freedom of speech as a result of this fire. So that was the beginning of Hitler becoming the dictator of Germany, and a very pivotal point in his coming in the beginning of, in the start of the Second World War. This is the other very famous photograph from the Reichstag. This is a photograph of a Soviet soldier putting the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. Now, as I said, the Second World War is so horrific, and some of the most horrific, probably the most horrific episodes of human history and humanity took place during these years. And one of the Holocaust is the first one that we think of. But another really horrific thing that happened is the Battle of Berlin at the end. The Soviet soldiers in Berlin, it's some appalling things took place in Berlin at the end of the war. One thing to bear in mind is, as I said at the beginning, roughly 75 million people died globally in the Second World War as a result of the Second World War. It's a relatively rough number. But of those 75, they think that around 33 million of those 75 were actually from the Soviet Union. The Russians ultimately paid the greatest price in winning the war for us, and that price was an entire generation. The way that they won under the dictator, the very evil dictator, Joseph Stalin, was that he just sent more and more men, because the men were expendable in Stalin's Soviet Union. The men were expendable, and when you read about battles like the Battle of Stalingrad, Leningrad, it's really brutal. Things that took place in Belarus, I mean, horrific. I'm not going to go into details, but as a result, when the Soviets got to Berlin, they had vengeance on their mind. And it's one of the most horrific episodes of the Second World War is what happened right at the end in Berlin. If you're interested in it, you can research it yourself. One thing that a lot of people don't know about in Berlin, which you must visit, is the Soviet Memorial Park in Treptow in East Berlin. And it's just incredible. It's like the size of an American football pitch, and it's like stepping into Russia in the 60s or something like that. There's even busts of Stalin still remaining in this park. I can't believe it managed to survive the 90s, but it did. And it's an absolutely incredible place to visit. The photographs that I found for this presentation really don't do it justice. You must visit it. It's absolutely breathtaking. It seems so removed from the world that we currently live in. And you see this statue up at the end is of a Russian warrior holding an enormous sword, and under his feet he's squashing a giant swastika. And it's an incredible place to visit, and you must go. The other, just before we end, I just wanted to mention this. This is a memorial to the millions of dead Jews of Europe. As I would hope that you know, somewhere in the region of 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. On top of that, many other people, homosexuals, Romani people, political dissidents. And this is a memorial in the center of Berlin to the killed Jews of Europe, instigated by the Nazis and others as well. But downstairs from this memorial, there's a downstairs, and in the downstairs they have the names of 3 million of the Jews they found, and all those 3 million names are written down there. It's traumatic and yeah, very moving, as you might expect, and it's something you have to do if you go to Berlin. And that this monument was placed there in the beginning, again around the beginning of the century, sometime 2005, something like that, I think. And just around the corner from here is where we're going to end. Whoops, it's here, this little car park in Berlin. It's a very indistinct car park, isn't it? But you know something's going on here because there's a little tour guide in the corner, as you can see. That's my German counterpart. And the reason for that is this car park is where Hitler's bunker was in the 30s and 40s. And this is where Hitler ended his life and brought about the end of the war. So the last time he was seen was on his birthday on the 20th of April. He came out to congratulate some of the boy soldiers who had been defending Berlin against the Soviets, just mere children, giving them medals, telling them that they were still going to win the war. Germany would still be victorious. And then he went back into his bunker. Some of you may have seen that movie Downfall, you know, the one you get lots of memes on the internet based on it, all set in his bunker at the end of his life. And then he became, eventually he was persuaded, and he realized that he'd lost the war. And on the 29th of April, he married his longtime girlfriend, Ava Braun. And the next day, they both committed suicide. So her and their dog, Blondie, took cyanide, and Hitler shot himself. And that was the end of the war. And also his generals who were down there, Joseph Goebbels and his family, they all committed suicide. So basically that's the end of the war. And on the 8th of May, victory in Europe was declared. And we should have been celebrating the 75th anniversary of VE Day last summer if it hadn't been for this pandemic. Listen, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you all so much for sticking with me. It was an epic undertaking compared to what I've done before for Mara. As I say, I'm not a military historian, but I've done this tour a few times. I believe next I'm going to be doing a tour about British music throughout the centuries. So that'll be more light-hearted. I hope you'll join me then, hopefully in April. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Mara. Over to you. Do I need to press anything?
No, you don't. You're good. Thank you. I have put up a Q&A slide. I want to thank you first for pretending to be a historian. You did a great job, and we appreciate it. I know a lot of people who already knew a lot about World War II history learned some things from you tonight, and they certainly appreciate your humor as well as your anecdotes. So thank you. I'm going to ask you to go over to the Q&A at this point, if you would be so kind. And we're going to run through some of these questions and see if we can add a little bit more content to the presentation. Are you ready for that, George?
I am, yes. You can hear me and everything, can't you? Yes, okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm just vetting these questions quickly, everybody. Okay, somebody's asking me about his grandfather was a US Army veteran. He's wondering where I might be able to find more information about his military life. I'm imagining there would be a US military website for that. I'm afraid I don't really know the answer to your question, basically is what I'm saying. And maybe somebody else watching the presentation would be able to make a suggestion. I know we have some military historians on this presentation. Was the Hawker Hurricane the plane that we mainly used? Yes, it was. And then the Spitfire was introduced on top of that because the Hurricane was a little bit too slow, it turned out. Didn't the Germans make the mistake of bombing by mistake London first, and the British retaliated by bombing Berlin? Todd W. Lund. Maybe you're right. I had heard the other way around though, but I'm prepared to be wrong. Was Westminster Abbey hit during the Blitz? It certainly was, yes. There's very famous photographs of Westminster Abbey. I thought that many women worked at Bletchley. You're right, they did. They did indeed. You might know that from the movie, The Imitation Game that you saw. What is Tommy's last name who built the Colossus computers? Flowers, as in, you know, flowers that you find in a field. How far is Portsmouth from London? And is this the port that cruisers also leave from? Yeah, there's a few ports that cruisers leave from. Portsmouth is one of them. How far is it from London? 3 hours, something like that. Why are there bullseyes painted on the RAF planes? Oh, that's a good question, anonymous attendee. I don't know the answer. I think it's just design. Maybe if somebody wants to correct me, please do. Any idea whether the leaders picked Tehran for a meeting place? I'm afraid not. Which D-Day beach lost the most soldiers? That would be certainly Omaha. Why was Eisenhower the general for the D-Day invasion instead of a British general? I guess because the Americans, by that point in the war, actually had more skin in the game, if you'll pardon the trite expression. There was more American soldiers involved, and they were actually kind of leading the Allied campaign at that point. How many people died again in the entire Second World War? It's a rough estimate, but they think somewhere between 75 and 100 million people, all in all, including soldiers, civilians. And all the different theaters of war. This most historically accurate movie recommendations. Oh, I mean, I could be here all night. I really like Band of Brothers. I think it's fantastic. I don't know about realistic. Yeah, there's many movies. A movie that I love, but if anybody watching here is squeamish or young, don't watch it. It's a Russian film called Come and See. Pretty horrific, but that's about the war in the East. Fantastic small museum at Arromanches too, with model of the landings. Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Graham Bennett. How many people died after being bombed in Caen? The number that is 20,000. Roughly 20,000 people were killed by Allied bombings in Caen during the Battle of Normandy. Eric Larsson's book, The Splendid and the Vile, tells a lot about this time and Churchill's role in the government. Thank you very much, Karen Burke. Which battles did Polish 303 fight in? That's the Battle of Britain. So the fighting in the air between the Luftwaffe and the RAF. They fought for the RAF, basically. What museums do you recommend near Normandy beaches? There are so many small ones. As I said, the Caen Memorial Museum, I think, is the best one by far. I would definitely go to that one. And there's some small ones by the beaches, and they're okay. But the Caen Memorial Museum, that's the one. Where's the best Eiffel Tower view at sunset? I can answer this question. It is, or can I? My mind's just gone blank. What's it called again? The Trocadero. See, I haven't been on tour for 2 years because of COVID. How did the Channel Islands figure into the battles? They didn't really figure into the battles, but the Channel Islands are just off the coast of France, but they are under British jurisdiction. So they were occupied by the Germans, basically, but they were essentially still British. So that was a part of Britain that was occupied by the Germans, essentially. War museums in or near Bayeux that you recommend? Again, the Caen Memorial Museum is not far. Oh yes, I'm sorry, Quebecois. I forgot to mention that lots of people hate de Gaulle because of his famous Vive le Québec Libre speech, and lots of people in Canada and Quebec hate it. I'm sorry that I mentioned that, but you'll be pleased that I told you the thing about the corkscrew so that you can use that to mock him. What kind of airplanes did the Polish 303 use? I think they used our planes, so the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. Any comment about de Gaulle almost giving away the D-Day invasion by making a radio broadcast the night before? Alexander Johnson. My comment would be, no, because I didn't know that, but that's very interesting. But yeah, very reckless. Are there wrecks of tanks in the forest? There's not wrecks of tanks, but there's lots of tanks that have been left there as monuments in tribute to the Battle of Bastogne. How many soldiers died from the cold loan? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. Hard to answer. What was the name of the Battle of the Bulge movie George recommended? Bastogne. Sorry, didn't catch it. Okay, that was an episode of Band of Brothers, and the episode of Band of Brothers is called Bastogne, which you spell B-A-S-T-O-I-G-N-E. So wait, when did the battle occur again? Which battle's that, anonymous attendee? The Battle of the Bulge, that was in 1944. In fact, the Normandy landings were in 1944. The Battle of Britain was in 1940. Okay, expand on the Jews in the Channel Islands turned over to the Nazis. I've never heard this before. Michael Amovitz. You're going to have to do a quick Google search for it, because I remember I read a book about it. I can't remember the details offhand, but I would look into that. But yeah, that's Britain's great shame in the Holocaust and the Nazi regime. What happened to Vichy at the end of the war and after? Well, Marshal Pétain was tried, and he was initially condemned to be executed. In France, they still executed people with a guillotine in those days, in fact, up until the 1960s. But eventually he was spared, and he was imprisoned for the rest of his life. But remember, already in 1940, he was 83 or something. So he died in the early 50s, in the early 50s, but he was a very old man, basically. What does D stand for in D-Day? That's a good question. I'm glad I can answer that. The answer is quite boring. It stands for day. For some reason, it's called Day. A friend took in the battle bus tour in France some years ago and quite enjoyed it. Would you recommend it? Do you know the area it operates in? Derek Thiel. I don't know this specific tour. I mean, obviously, I take tours in buses around Normandy quite often. Would I recommend it? Yes, but I don't really know that specific company, so I can't recommend or not recommend them. My husband was in the 82nd Airborne Division. Are there tours that follow the path of the 82nd battles? There will definitely be specialist ones, yes. I don't have the information. You need to look that up. Rochelle Martinez answers the question before. Try the National World War II Museum in New Orleans for your question about your grandfather's service. Great, thank you very much for that. Are there any cruise lines that run tours of what you described? Cruise lines as in boats? Not so much. You'd take a ferry, then you could get a bus tour. I know that there are ones done It's like Band of Brothers tours and things like that. Beginning date, years of the war, and end date, May the 8th. Yes, beginning date was the 1st of September 1939. Karen Cornish, thank you. World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. should have a searchable database of all servicemen and women in World War II. Thank you very much, L.A. Killian, or is that La Killian? Where and when did the Canadian and US pilots join the British to fly the Spitfires? I think the Canadians were in from the beginning. The Canadians joined the war as soon as the British. I don't know about the US pilots in relation to the Spitfires. Sorry. Why were the Netherlands left away from the list of allies? Because they weren't officially allies, I guess. I don't know the answer to that, basically. I don't dare attempt to answer that in case there's anybody from Holland here. Are there places in France that are poisoned from World War I and still uninhabitable? I don't know the answer to that, I'm sorry. What's the part of Franco in Spain? I could do a whole tour about the Spanish Civil War. Spain voted in a Republican government. The government was very anti things like the church and the establishment. The army didn't like this, so they staged a coup, a military coup, where they took the country back under Franco. This turned into a war. It turned into an incredibly ugly civil war in Spain. And Franco won, the fascists won. Franco was in control of Spain until the 1970s, but as a result of which Spain did not engage in the Second World War. US Army personnel records for World War II. Check the National Archives US website, www.nara.gov, N-A-R-A.gov for information. Jan Robinson, you mentioned that the French clocks were changed to Berlin time. Do you know what time zone they were in before that? I can't remember the name of it. It's European Central or something like that. How many hours was the Dunkirk rescue? It took place over a long period of time, over weeks. The bullseye on the British planes was the national insignia, like stars on US planes. So the bullseye is our national insignia. Thank you very much, Kevin Brown. Karen Katzer, please recommend those with an interest in the Spitfire tour, the Museum of Spitfires in Southampton. Karen Katzer went there in 2019 and it was amazing. Okay, I've never been there. I'd love to go. Bombings took place at other industrial ports, industrial centers. Yes. Liverpool, Plymouth, Birmingham, absolutely. I didn't mention any of the other places because I was talking about London, but yes, extensive bombing in Liverpool. The really famous place that was really bombed in the UK was Coventry. Coventry, the town of Coventry was completely destroyed. And some people say that Churchill he knew that it was going to be destroyed and he let the Luftwaffe go ahead and bomb them. Gwen Carr, my uncle was in Patton's army. Is there a database about who was injured in Patton's army? I can't answer you any better than a Google search, I'm afraid. But good luck finding out because it sounds very interesting. First 30-minute sequence of Saving Private Ryan was realistic, according to my late grandfather, Chandy Maydad. Thank you, Chandy. About who was injured in Patton's army? I don't understand the question. Sorry, Gwen. Rephrase. Anonymous, do you think the Germans had superior engineering? Absolutely, yes, still do. What are the main memorial museums of World War II in Europe? Well, the ones that I've mentioned, really, the Common Memorial in Berlin, there's many ones. There's huge ones in Bastogne around the Battle of the Bulge as well. There's a museum dedicated to the 101st Airborne Division there, actually. Were French civilians angry at the US because of the bombing before D-Day? Yes, I should think so. Yes, I mean a lot of French civilians lost their lives because of bombing. It's the nature of aerial bombardment, isn't it? Did the Canadians contribute air power to the Allies? Yes, as I said, in the Battle of Britain, the Canadians took part in the Battle of Britain. Are there more memorials in the Ardennes forest area? Yes, there are many memorials, tanks, all sorts of things. Yes, absolutely. Notable French resistance places to visit. That's a tricky one. Not that I can think of. Again, look it up. For research on US military soldiers, state with National Archives. Okay, Google National Archives. They're located in Maryland. Thank you very much, anonymous attendee. D-Day in English is Jejour in French. Seems odd, but true. Thank you, Graham. What video game best represents the war? El Kajal, I'm proud to say that I don't know anything about video games. It's one of the only vices that I don't have. The most popular food during World War II? No idea, sorry. But they were on very extreme rationing, obviously, so it probably wasn't very nice. Traditionally, the soldiers would have cans of corned beef, that sort of thing. Every invasion, Europe or the Pacific, was a D-Day. Hannah Reid, thank you very much. Yes, that's right. D-Day just means the day of the invasion. Also, this is from Jean Hansen. Thank you, Jean. Also, the Battle of Hurtgen Forest is another interesting aspect. There's a great movie on HBO called When Trumpets Fade that talks about it. I'm going to watch that. Thank you very much. When in Saint-Mère-Église, the people kept coming up to us and thanking us for saving them, Julie Arkin says. So there you go. In answer to the question about the French resentment about the bombing, no, I think in general, the French realized they were being liberated. RAF painter symbol was to aid recognition from the ground troops to stop friendly fire, shooting them down. Neil Ausner. That sounds right to me. So yeah, so the symbol, the bullseye on the airplane was so the ground troops would know not to shoot them down in friendly fire. Thanks for that. How did Switzerland remain neutral? The same way it always did. It basically banked everybody's money and stayed out of the action. At Verdun, sorry, that was some of my bias coming out there. At Verdun, except for the grassy area around the monument, the woody areas are posted live mines, stay out, or something along those lines. Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn. The Splendid and the Vile is an excellent book. Okay, Jill Skinner, thank you very much. Spain became a training ground for Germany's armed forces, and that's from Paul Rolland. Yes, that's right. And the Germany, they sent some troops there who did train there. Yeah, absolutely. Any idea how to add names in the Berlin Holocaust Memorial basement of those who perished? Carol Papkin. I imagine you'd send them an email. So if you look up Berlin Holocaust Memorial, you should find it. Was Scotland and Ireland also bombed? It certainly was. Scotland was bombed. I happen to know this because I'm from Edinburgh. And one of the first Luftwaffe raids was actually down the Firth of Forth in Scotland. And there was a lot of shipbuilding in Glasgow. So Glasgow was severely bombed during the war. Also, Ireland was bombed, even though Ireland was neutral during the Second World War, because they had recently become independent and they had issues with the Brits, obviously. But Ireland was mistakenly bombed by the Luftwaffe on several occasions when the Luftwaffe got completely lost, didn't know where they were. Carolyn Cohen, very good point. The Imperial War Museum, Duxford, has lots of aeroplanes. That is another great aeroplane RAF museum. What are the effects of World War II today? I sort of answered that, didn't I? So nuclear power, computing, geopolitical, China, America's wealth and sort of cultural. I mean, so after the war, there was this thing, the Marshall Plan, where the Americans gave lots of European countries money to recover from the war. And this money came with a catch, which basically meant that the Americans got to exert their influence over Europe. So America became the powerful nation that it is now, partly as a result of the Second World War. French Resistance Museum opposite the Catacomb in Paris. Graham Bennett, you are very well informed indeed. I'm glad you're on this tour. Thank you very much. So yeah, opposite the Catacombs in Paris, there is a Resistance Museum. I haven't been to, but I will go to next time in Paris in 20 years' time or whenever that is. Thank you, Graham. One good museum and history area regarding the French resistance is in Lyon. That's correct. If you're interested in the French resistance, there's a fantastic French movie called The Army of Shadows. Okay, and a lot of it is set in Lyon as well. So yeah, Lyon was the home, the HQ, the headquarters for the French resistance. So watch Army of Shadows. It's a fantastic movie. It's in French. You have to read the subtitles, but that's a great movie about the resistance in France. Is it true the first German soldier was killed by a Japanese soldier? Asking for my second. Todd, I have no idea. It sounds interesting though. Kathy, if you're looking for a really impressive day-by-day account of the London Blitz, try Connie Willis's Blackout and All Clear. They are technically science fiction, but well-researched and very descriptive. Thank you very much, Kathy. Okay, here we go. Thank you for this, Megan. You're a lifesaver. My son says Battlefield 5 for video game recommendation. Thank you very much. I'm gonna make a note of it now. What tanks were most used in the war for both sides? Okay, the famous German tanks were the Panzers. The Sherman tanks, the Americans used the Shermans. And I mean, all different countries had different tanks, but I'd say the Shermans and the Panzers are the most famous. Robin Williams, Canada played a major role in training pilots who then joined Fighter Command or Bomber Command in the UK. The Commonwealth Flying Programme in Canada, mostly on the prairies, trained pilots of Commonwealth countries as well as American pilots who joined the RCAF and RAF before the US entered the war in 1941. Thank you very much, Robin Williams. US soldiers are often portrayed in movies as cocky, arrogant, and loud. Is that how they really were? Come on, Suzanne. I mean, there's a lot of soldiers involved. I'm sure some of them were cocky and some of them were perfectly lovely. I'm sure that's the same with soldiers from all around the world. Did Newfoundland have any presence in World War II after the devastation they experienced after World War I? Yes, Newfoundland were involved directly in the Second World War, as well as Canada. I don't have anything for you about that. Again, you're going to have to research that. I'm sorry. I was aware that when I do these tours, it's usually with American groups, but I was aware there might be a lot of Canadians on this tour. So I didn't do quite as much research as I could have, but I couldn't fit everything in. I apologize. But Newfoundland, some of my favorite groups that I've ever worked with were from Newfoundland. It's like having a bus full of Irish people. Is World War II your favorite history lesson? What was the total cost of World War II? The total cost was tens of millions of lives. You know, it's an endless question. Is it my favorite history lesson? My favorite subject? I wouldn't say so. I find it quite upsetting, actually. Even researching this tour, I found myself straying into things that I found quite upsetting. It's a very upsetting time in history, but obviously it's very interesting as well. Paul Rolland trained many spies at Camp X under Sir William Stevenson and helped in ending the war. This must be the Canadians you're talking about, Paul. Thank you for that. Derek Thiller, the Commonwealth Air Training Plan. There's a small museum near Brandon, Manitoba in Canada. Thank you. Cynthia, there's a great resistance museum in Amsterdam. That's correct. Yes, there's also a great Dutch movie about the Dutch resistance as well. I can't remember the name of it. It was made by the director Paul Verhoeven, who went on to make the RoboCop movies. If you search Paul Verhoeven, Dutch resistance movie, that's a fantastic movie. Okay, 10,000 Canadian soldiers were based in Hampshire. Tented accommodation stories of how well behaved and loved they were by locals still exist today. On the way to Portsmouth from London on the A3 is a Canadian memorial planting of maple trees. I'm sure that's true. Thank you, Neil Ausnet. Soldier of Orange, Tiffany Selfridge, thank you very much. You're right, it is. Soldier of Orange is the Dutch movie about the resistance directed by Paul Verhoeven. Das Boot is a fantastic movie about the U-boats in the Second World War. Yes, thank you for that. Who did you say was known as the corkscrew because of the way he waved his hands? That was General de Gaulle. If there's any French conservative people watching this, they might be angry at me for saying that. Do you know any World War museums in Northern Ireland? Not really. Not really, I'm sorry. The Avro Lancaster bombers were important, correct? Yes, they're very important bomber planes. There's also very other important battles involving the Royal Air Force that I didn't mention. For example, the famous Dam Busters. Some of you may have seen that movie. Frank Knight, I want to add, based on my readings, during the Battle of Britain, a single German bomber accidentally bombed London. The British immediately retaliated against Berlin with multiple bombers. Hitler immediately switched from targeting the RAF to targeting London, another of his major mistakes, leaving the RAF free to recover and carry on. That is correct, Frank Knight. I mean, that's interesting about the single German bomber accidentally letting one off in London. That sounds very likely to me. And yes, you're right. When the Luftwaffe changed tactic to bombing London instead of the airfields, that did give the RAF time to recover, and that was actually we're very grateful for that opportunity. Which country profited the most from World War II, if any? America, dare I say? About how many days would this tour take in person? I think it would take 10 days. Have you visited Patton's grave in Ham? I'm afraid I haven't, but General Patton, he died in 1945, soon after the end of the war in a car accident, I'm afraid to say. But no, I haven't been to his grave. What year did Churchill die? Can't remember. Sorry, if anybody can correct me. I've been to his grave lots of times. That's somewhere I go on tour quite often. It's near his house, Chartwell. Robin Williams, there are 2 surviving airworthy Lancaster bombers, one in England and one in Canada. Several years ago, the Canadian Lanc met her sister in the UK and they had an historical flight together. Very nice. Thank you, Robin Williams. Oh, here we go. Another video game recommendation is War Thunder. If you like vehicular combat, it's also free. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you, Kathy. Churchill died in 1965. The German occupation of the Channel Islands lasted for most of the Second World War, from the 30th of June 1940 until their liberation on the 9th of May 1945. Guernsey is the largest. Yes, you're correct. What do you know of the Battle of Saipan? Not enough to say anything right now, sorry. If planning a trip going forward, where's the best place to find a tour director, and what was the difference between a director and a guide for Googling purposes? Thanks. Okay, if I'm being honest, a tour director is like a posh name for a tour guide. The best place to find a tour director would be through a travel company such as EF or Go Ahead, which is also with EF, or other companies. There's a lot of companies that tour around and do war tours and tours all around Europe. You just need to do Google Trafalgar Gate 1. But yes, Paul Rowland, Canadians played a major role in liberating the Netherlands. That's correct. And every year, children decorate Canadian war graves. Canada sheltered the Dutch royal family in Ottawa, where Princess Margaret was born, at the Ottawa Civic Hospital. Thank you very much, Paul Rowland. No, Northern Ireland, I'm afraid not. The Netherlands were neutral and then became occupied. Correct. Yes, that's right. That's why they weren't listed as allies, because they were neutral before they were occupied. Any book recommendations? I mean, I've got a lot of books about this. There's a fantastic book that, I mean, all sorts. There's a great one about the French resistance. God, I can't remember what it's called now. The dark something, France's Dark Years, I think it's called. It's a great book about the resistance. My father-in-law landed on Utah Beach, and the first round they tried to fire out their mortar was a dud due to the cigarettes stuffed inside back in England. Sorry to hear that, Denise Keller. I hope he survived. On the map for the Battle of the Bulge, there is Lincoln's farmhouse in the northwest corner. What happened there? I can't tell you offhand, but it would have been a famous site involved in the fighting around the Battle of Bulge. Robert Kelman, thank you very much. Robert Kelman is saying, bless your heart with trying to answer some of these questions. Thank you very much. I do my hardest. It's the same when I'm on the bus as well. And Hannah Reed suggests any book by Alex Kershaw or Rick Atkinson. Laura Carter, X-Company is an interesting Canadian show about spies and training. All right,
George.
Is that all? Okay.
I'm gonna jump in, since half of our questions were comments, which was great because it added a lot of context to the tour. Right. I'm gonna jump in by telling you or answering that question about what's the difference between a tour guide and a tour director. A tour guide is usually somebody who specifically knows a city or a site, and they are an expert in that topic. A tour director takes you on an entire tour, which might be 10 days, 14 days, 7 days, and stays with you and handles all of your logistics, and really is a surface expert on everything, right? Is that a pretty good explanation?
I think it is, but I wouldn't have been able to say that because I would have sounded very cocky.
Well, of course, that's why I did it for you. So you're welcome. So everybody, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. As you well know, these tours are serving two purposes. They're helping our tour directors, so tip if you're able to, and they are helping us keep engaged and keeping ourselves interested during this lockdown and travel restriction time. So I just want to say thank you again, and I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll see you next week. So here we are, and cheers, George. It's always nice to see you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And Mara, thanks again to Mara for inviting us back and for saving our bacon during these very difficult times for me and my industry. So thanks, Mara, and thank you all very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. Good night.